After 9/11, the war on terror bankrolled the coercive capacities of Arab authoritarian regimes, even as the American invasions of Iraq in 2003 and Afghanistan the year before further raised the specter of militant Islamism.
The Americans brought democracy to Iraq. We've seen what that democracy was. I'm a results-oriented person, and I want to judge by the results. Iraq is 400 years back from what it were under the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein.
What happened is the growth was 5%, 6% GDP, but the actual per capita gain per person was less than that. So people were improving. I mean, this is one thing that we have this sort of fixation. We think that, and frankly, I'm sorry, but, you can look at neoliberal arguments, and I'm not a fan of neoliberal policies, but at the end of the day, the overall wealth and position of the average Arab person was going up. But the point here is that it wasn't going up fast enough for what the Arab person believed they deserved.
We have a struggle, and we know that spring is coming, and Damascus is going to be as beautiful as before, and we're going to go live together, all of us.
I also want to give thanks to the Chippewa of Rama, of the First Nations, for allowing us to convene on their land. Yesterday's address is a stark reminder of the continuing injustices settler colonialism has brought to Turtle Island. It is also a reminder of the reason why Palestinians are so steadfast in their resistance to Israeli settler colonialism. The defeat of Arab armies by Israel, by the Israeli Defense Force in 1948 and 1976 were traumatic events for Palestinians. In continuing violations of international law, Palestinian land was expropriated, and the Israeli apartheid regime that we now know was set up. 1967 was also marked a deep caesura in Arab politics and thought, and this is what I'm going to be talking about today. So 1967 generated considerable intellectual disillusionment, but also far-reaching Arab introspection. As radical regimes atrophied into static authoritarianism, many Arab intellectuals began to lose faith in people power and nationalism. Some began to embrace political Islam and secular discourses of authenticity, while others abandoned the quest for social revolution, cultural autonomy, and political agency altogether. The very notion that ideas had a role to play in social and political transformation came under question. Many Arab intellectuals replaced the commonly held idea that economic conditions caused underdevelopment with pervasive culturalist arguments that Arabs are culturally or psychologically retarded or deficient, what might be called an autopsy of Arab culture. The 1970s and all the way to the 1990s, we witnessed massive IMF-imposed transformations and post-populist authoritarian restructuring. Some intellectuals experimented with radical alternatives, from Maoism to Khomeiniism. Others turned to cultural introspection and rediscovered Ibn Khaldun and even Hannah Arendt. But it was the Palestinian-American scholar Edward Said's epistemological critique of Western representations of the non-Western other, that Rima alluded to in her introduction yesterday, which had the most enduring and divisive influence on Middle East studies and on the Arab left. The academic discipline did not want to be told it contributed structurally to the Western domination of the Middle East. The Arab left felt betrayed by Said's equation between Marx, Ernest Renan, and Joseph Conrad. They resented his book Orientalism's underlying cultural nationalism, which diminished their own revolutionary work and class struggle on the ground. The Oxford historian and author of The Arabs, A History, sums up the last decade with a drastic superlative, and I quote, "The 2000s were the worst decade in all of Arab history." But it's quite true. Even in the darkest decades of the Mongolian and European invasions, or of the Lebanese Civil War and the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, there has not been this much general despair and all-encompassing militarization of an entire regime. After 9/11, the war on terror bankrolled the coercive capacities of Arab authoritarian regimes, even as the American invasions of Iraq in 2003 and Afghanistan the year before further raised the specter of militant Islamism, and of course the specter of an outbreak of sectarian violence in the region. The tacit agreement between the state and society in the Arab world began to crumble as authoritarian regimes had to pull its diminishing resources out of social security and public welfare provisioning. The cost of subsistence level living skyrocketed in many countries, to the same degree as the conspicuous consumption of those classes who have benefited from IMF privatization policies and World Bank austerity measures have increased. Most Middle East specialists had been busy trying to make sense of the strange stability of the authoritarian regimes and the apparently inexplicable absence of social and political forces challenging them. This was before 2011. Few studied or articulated the social conditions that brought about the current revolutionary changes. To be sure, it's far too early to speculate whether the popular uprisings that have rocked the Arab world last year will lead to a radically different future. The counter-revolution is in full swing in North Africa and in the Middle East alike. But we can start interrogating the past in light of the unexpected present developments. Were scholars simply too distracted to notice subterranean revolutionary trends in the past 2 decades, that terrible decade of the 2000s? Or is the spontaneity and action orientation of the uprisings an indication that Islamist, liberal, and post-liberal thought, that ideas and intellectuals, on the whole, were at an impasse? I think the best place to look for answers to these questions and to make sense of the development of Arab political ideas is in Arabic cultural and literary journals. And what I've done over the past few days in preparation for this talk is to read an article from 2002 by the great Arab novelist and public intellectual Ilyas Khouri, who unfortunately couldn't come at the last minute to address us. In At-Tariq, he wrote an incredible essay of historical self-criticism. And 10 years on, and with the benefit of hindsight, we could call it visionary. So in this recently revived Arab Marxist literary journal, At-Tariq, Khouri made a passionate appeal for a third Arab cultural uprising, or Nahda. The article is entitled Min Ajal Nahda al-Thalitha. And I'll use Arabic terms and some of the names of these intellectuals throughout, courtesy of the many Arab Canadian students and young folks, some of whom I've had the privilege of teaching, who are in the audience, because some of you might have heard from your parents or grandparents about these names and terms. Now, the timing of his article, Khouri admitted, could not have been much less conducive either to such optimism to speak of a third cultural awakening or to such a retrospect of a first and second Nahda. But he has given us a succinct analysis of the dashed hopes of the first 2 cultural revivals, the first 2 Nahdas, in a remarkable attempt to chart a brighter future out of what has already shaped up at his time of writing, 2002, to be a very bleak decade. In this past decade, the artistic innovation, cultural criticism, and progressive politics that developed in the shadows of colonialism and authoritarianism in the past century and a half appear to have been forgotten. Past defeats, however, were not forgotten. They came to be remedied with culturalist rhetoric, a return to atavistic or hypocritical to use Ahmad bin Shamsi's term, social practices. So the first Nahda, what was the first Nahda? Many of you might not know that there was a cultural sort of revival, even uprising, if you will, in the 19th century. And Ilyas Khoury goes back to this to help us, as he put it, to get out of the frightful depression which has descended on the Arabs in the 21st century. So he's going back to the 19th century to see what happened, what went well, what went wrong. And so the first Nahda began in the 19th century and extended, according to Khoury's reading, to the 1930s. It culminated in two characteristics. First, the rejection of Ottoman tyranny and the call for constitutional government. And the second characteristic was the call for independence and unity. The first Nahda Khoury considers incomplete because it did not see coming the defeat at gunpoint of the East by the rising colonial powers. Instead, it saw itself as an extension of the past. So after the great linguistic renaissance of people like Al-Yazigi, Ahmad Faris al-Shidyak, and Boutros al-Bustani, the latter two both converts, by the way, after the great modernization in literature, or literary sensitivity, with the Arab poets around Khalil Gibran, in New York and Boston in the 1920s. And after the new literary form, which the Syro-Lebanese emigres to Egypt developed, in particular in the historical novel, the social novel, and in journalism, after all these artistic innovations, Khoury argues, Arab culture found itself a captive of the past in its religious and linguistic realms. Thought remained within accommodationist bounds, which the Al-Afghani Abdu experiment represented to sort of modern Islamic thinkers. There remained also politics that circled around the dream of reviving the Golden Age before the Ottomans. And so in spite of the obstructions, in spite of the experience of these people of the Nahda, as they are called, and in spite of their cultural deeds and progressive thought, and even Shibli Shemayel's secularism, what stands out is the willful neglect, argues Khoury, of the biggest event which afflicted 19th century Lebanon and Syria, the civil war from 1840 to 1860. So Khoury, writing in 2002, admonishes his predecessors for not doing enough self-criticism at the time in the mid-19th century. He blames obscuring historical truth and the inability to describe the truth, and that this has resulted in a kind of literature of subterfuge. Despite Gibran's call for reform and awakening, Arabic thought of the first Nahda did not dare to overstep sectarian and tribal divisions. The Middle East and North Africa emerged out of World War II with a mixed record. The euphoria of independence in Lebanon and Syria was dampened by the creation of the State of Israel and the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from their homeland. Turkey ended the one-party system and began experimenting with a more democratic, yet tumultuous, system of government. In North Africa, the struggle for independence gained momentum, culminating, of course, in Algerian independence, which we are now celebrating the 50th anniversary of, along with Jamaica. Many nationalists argued that liberation from colonialism followed logically in the liberation of Europe from fascism at the time. And the Arabian Peninsula entered into a phase of state building and institutional development in the 1960s. And the Persian Gulf, still under British dominion, achieved independence finally in the early 1970s. Now the second Nahda, the second cultural revival, was born out of a search for a way out of the curse of defeat, as Khoury calls it, the curse of defeat and occupation. The first Nahda produced a mix of intellectuals of multiple doctrines, nationalists, Islamists, liberals, secularists, and socialists. But the second Nahda was based on the conflict between the army officer of rural background who engineered agricultural reform and land reform, the nationalization of the Suez Canal, and the unity between Syria and Egypt, on the one hand, and the urbane middle-class intellectual who spoke of the Enlightenment, translated English, French, and German poetry, and lambasted Arab regimes for not doing enough to avenge the Palestinian plight. Khoury puts it like this: the second Nahda began with a thunderbolt. The loss of Palestine in 1948, or the Nakba, carried within it a needle of radical revolt, as he calls it, a revolt of concepts, literary practices, and structure of political power. And it began with a text. I'm an intellectual historian, so I look for texts that generate practice and movements. It began with a text, perhaps a predecessor of Rami Khoury at the American University of Beirut. It began with Konstantin Zorek's devastating cultural autopsy or autocritique, The Meaning of Disaster, Mana al-Nakba. In 1948, a few weeks after the creation of the State of Israel, Zorek argued that Arabs have only themselves to blame for being stuck in a vainglorious past, without thinking deeply about power, without recognizing the reality of a hostile world, and for not militarizing properly. In other words, for not doing what the Zionists had done so successfully and at the expense of gullible Arabs. This text and his author, a Tweedy Syrian Christian historian at the American University of Beirut, for decades in fact, galvanized a host of radical political tendencies, nationalist movements, and new armed organizations, who rallied around the slogan of the second Nahda, al-Inqilab, the revolt. Indeed, within 10 years of the Nakba, the Arab leaders deemed responsible for the loss of Palestine were overthrown or killed. First in Syria, the year of the three coups, 1949. Then the King of Jordan was assassinated in 1951. Then Nasser's three officers in Egypt in 1952. And finally, in the most revolutionary of years, during the Second Nahda, 1958, the Hashemite monarchy of Iraq was ousted in a bloody military coup. Now, Khoury's essay reminds us that the political and military revolt was accompanied by a profound cultural revolt, represented at three levels: modern poetry, and in particular the free verse movement in Iraq, in which the dominance, in fact the hegemony of pre-Islamic and Abbasid poetry were toppled as the pinnacle of literary achievement and replaced by the playful resurrection of mythical topoi and genres. And so Arabic poetry in this period entered into a phase of totally unknown adventure. Second, the naturalist and the realist novels emerged in this period. And of course, the beacon of this trend is the late Nobel Prize of Literature winner Naguib Mahfouz of 1988. And third, the leftist nationalist thought emerging and the political transformist movements, especially Marxists, blew new life into criticism and the meaning of culture. The great Moroccan historian Abdallah Lawi and other Marxist Arab intellectuals have long spoken of a second true Nahda, which is sometimes described as the dynamization, a tathwir, of Arab thought in the late 1960s. In the 60s. It contained elements and efforts at national literacy promotion and programs, school curriculum reforms, the expansion of tertiary education, the mushrooming of cultural magazines, and the flourishing of the translation industry. And the best Arabic translators of English were always Palestinians. Now, by the time the popular uprisings broke out in Tunisia and in Egypt in 2011, the dominant intellectual paradigm was centrism, al-Wasatiyya. Al-Wasatiyya had attracted many political reformers and religious accommodationists, as the political space for alternative visions had all but abated. in the crosshairs of these stifling developments in the 1980s and 90s. Centrist Islam was not the moderate Islam that Western think tanks were busy manufacturing, nor was it intellectually radical or even original. Ideas of modernist Islam or Islamic liberalism have been floating around since Al-Afghani and Muhammad Abdu in the late 19th century. Yusuf Qardawi, Fahmi Huwaidi, Muhammad Al-Imara, and Rashid Ghanouchi distanced themselves from the extremist violence, and here the assassination of Sadat in 1981 was the kind of the trigger for al-Wasatiyya in many ways. But they're also very critical of the West on account of their own military violence everywhere in the Middle East, for their military support of Israeli violence against Palestinians. And they espouse a cultural nationalism grounded in an identitarian Islam, and much less in a critique of economic conditions, for example. And so this often pitted Wasatiyya advocates or intellectuals against certain state policies, like, say, Mubarak's support for the US. But this opposition was usually negotiable and not absolute. Its economic outlook was tied to Gulf interests and Gulf money, and was subject to Saudi pressures in particular. And so, if this was the intellectual current that was most dominant on the cusp, on the eve of December 2010, what is the status of the intellectual or of intellectual trends? And my conclusion then. My conclusion is, of course, let's all return to Ilyas Houri's work, in which he says, in spite of all, warts and all, whatever flaws of the first and second Nahda had, whatever its shortcomings, we must draw, read, study them in order to build a third Nahda on three principles: democracy, and not democracy top-down, much less from outside at the barrel of a gun, but much more in a Gramscian sense of building civil society in order to shift the dominant discourse. Second, to get rid of what he calls the old language. And by this he doesn't just mean Abbasi poetry, but also the bombastic language that of glorious a glorious Arab future and the recovery of Palestine that is just void of any sense of reality. And thirdly and finally, he advocates the overthrow of military rule. And by this, he doesn't mean just what has so far happened in Egypt, for example, or in elsewhere, but in fact a total overthrow of the whole military mindset, that the military could be the answer to questions and problems of Arab society. And he sort of castigates Arab militaries for fighting much more their own societies than any real sort of foreign enemy. Now, he's no pacifist, but he says that the problem, one of the root problems, or one of the missions that the third Nahda has, is to overcome the worshipping of the military. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Jens. That was absolutely wonderful. Noor, you next. Thank you so much. Sorry, thanks. Perfect. Great. Thank you so much, Noor.
Good morning, my friends. I would like to start this with a few thanks. I'd like to thank the Rama community for this great hosting of the event in here, and thank them also for the great history lesson. I've learned a lot about a fundamental component of the Canadian mosaic yesterday, so I wish them luck. I've learned a lot about the success of the many communities and the hard work that needs to be done in there. I'd like also to thank my friend at the Canadian Arab Federation Board, Walid Khujali, who introduced me to RIMA and the Couchiching Institute, and that's why we're here today. If it weren't for them, I wouldn't be speaking to you today. And I'd like also to extend thanks to Rashid and Eric for bringing about this topic of a discussion. This is a taboo topic in many places, and I thank them for their courage to bring this forward. The Couchiching Institute on Public Affairs, it's a great venue for us. If we had some civil debate in the Arab world that is similar to what happens in the Couchiching Institute, we wouldn't be putting such a conference in here. So we thank them also for this. We are lucky that we live in Canada. We have an open and civil debate about all the topics. There's no taboo about anything, and this is what we lack in many places in the world, including all the Arab world, no exception. The other thing that I'd like to start and talk about is what they call the Arab Spring. Till now, I'm kind of brainwashed about the word. I use the word Arab Spring, but I can't believe within me that this is an Arab Spring. We really need an Arab Spring. But is this a spring? Absolutely not. It started in the winter, so it should be called an Arab winter. Well, that's a joke. If you believe this one, if you believe this as a reasoning, then you would believe anything. So. In the Arab world, and I speak as somebody who came from Lebanon, I visited Egypt on work for politics, and I've witnessed the revolution. I was working with political parties there. I went twice before the revolution and 4 times after the revolution, and I've seen most of the action that is happening there. I have visited Syria many times. I have extended family in Syria. I recently went to Syria, and I've also witnessed lots of the things that are happening in there. And of course, we follow on a daily basis what's happening in there. And I hope that I can bring some of those basic experiences so that we can be realistic in our discussion of what we call the Arab Spring, as opposed to being so optimistic that this is a renaissance that has happened. It came from the ground up. They're toppling regimes, and the picture is going to be very beautiful afterwards. In fact, it's a very, very gloomy picture in most of the Arab world. In Egypt, in Tunisia, in Yemen, in Libya, in Syria, you name it, and still the other countries that they did not have any movements yet. And I'm going to be dwelling on this a little bit. In the Arab world, we had some kind of exceptionalism. Everybody in the West was dealing with the Arab world as if they're exempted from democracy. Hosni Mubarak was a darling for most of the American presidents. They've dealt with him. They had red carpet for him in every country, and it was fine, and it was great. And so was Saddam Hussein, and so was Hafiz al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad, and so was Ben Ali, and so was Ali Abdullah Saleh, and so are the sheikhs of all the kingdoms that we have in Morocco and in Saudi Arabia and in United Arab Emirates and in Qatar. So what brought all this change? Why now? And why is it for some of the countries but not for the others? One thing that we can say now is that the Arab exceptionalism is shattered. There is no exception anymore. Arab peoples, and I say peoples because they're not a united thing. Many scholars have spoke about the Arab people as being one. No, they are many different factions and groups, and we should call them as peoples. And the Arab peoples, just like any people in the world, they aspire for freedom and democracy. And they're capable of achieving democracy. And they're willing to pay the price that is associated with that democracy, whatever that price is going to be. We've seen revolutions before, again, in Algeria, for instance. It's called the country of the million martyrs, when they resisted occupation in there, and they were willing to pay big prices for freedom. So that's one of the things that we need to debate and talk about. The other thing is, most of the scholars in general and Orientalists, they have theorized that religion and traditions are no barriers to that freedom, to that democracy, to that progressiveness that's going to happen in the Arab world. So based on these notes, we think that an Arab Spring is achievable. It should be done. It must be done, actually. However, it has to be built from bottom up, and it has to be based on citizenship, and it has to be based on the building of nations within the countries that are building their futures. One of the major things that still preoccupies the Arab world is Arabism in itself, the language, and religion. And while most scholars speak about citizenship, there are lots of minorities, as Dr. Khoury spoke about, in the Arab world, probably 100 of them. In Lebanon alone, we have 17 sectarian groups. But still, they define themselves in far ways from citizenship as they should have done. In fact, there's a commercial on Lebanese TV that speaks about I'm American, I'm Colombian, I'm French, I'm Canadian. Yet in Lebanon, they tell you I'm Sunni, I'm Druze, I'm Catholic, I'm Shiite, I'm Orthodox. And that's the differentiation. And while the hopes are high, and we've seen Dr. Khoury talking about this, that this is, minorities should never talk about themselves as minorities. But he ended his note as, I'm a Christian Arab Democrat. So that was his definition. And that preoccupies probably every person in the Arab world. They try to identify themselves as an Arab, and I'm a Christian, or I'm a Muslim, and then they dive into the little details, and then last, I'm a Democrat, I'm a citizen. And this is what we need to profess about, and we need to walk the talk. And we're far from doing that in the Arab world. Democracy everywhere and in the Arab world it's not meaningful in the absence of liberation from occupation and foreign domination. The Americans brought democracy to Iraq. We've seen what that democracy was. I'm a results-oriented person, and I want to judge by the results. Iraq is 400 years back from what we're under the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein. So the liberation from foreign powers is more important. Was it about democracy? That was the slogan. That was the title. But it was about oil. It was about resources. The democracies that we're seeing nowadays in the Arab world are very similar to what we've seen in Iraq. It is about the resources in those lands. The Americans and the NATO, on one side, they would like to have puppet regimes in the Arab world, wherever they are. They are military dictators. They're fine with them if they're puppets. If people are going to throw them out, that's acceptable, provided that whoever is going to come next have to fit within the same equation. Mohammed Morsi of Egypt is just another Mubarak with a beard. If you see what kind of concessions and what kind of talk he had with Hillary Clinton and other people, he is just another Mubarak, and he does not represent all those people who went to Tahrir Square. In Libya, Abdul Jalil is regarded in many places in the Arab world as Al-Abd al-Dhalil, or he's somebody who is a slave that is a low-level slave, because he's got masters outside that they are doing whatever they want. And if you look at the different details of what happened in Libya, we had a brutal dictator, Muammar Gaddafi. People want dignity, a big word. People want freedom. People want democracy. What's happening in Libya now? Tribal fights. We're far from democracy. I have few friends who work with me in Egypt, and now they're working in Libya, and I'm still in contact with them. They see a big difference between what's happening in Egypt and what's happening in Libya. Yet, they tell you that a country is destroyed. It's going to be another Iraq. And what are we offering in the West from that democracy that we fought for, that we sent our troops for? Nothing. Minister Byrd went to Libya. Many CEOs went with him. And Minister Edfast, the Minister of Trade, went there. They had big discussions, and they had a full press release for us, Canadians, to see what we've gained. They said, Canadians, we're expert in oil exploration, we're experts in construction, we're experts in information and communication technologies, and this is what we're going to offer the Libyans. Libya is a cash cow, lots of oil, we're going to get our share. Not a single mention that we're going to build democratic institutions in Libya, that we're going to help build civil institutions in Libya, that we're going to train the Libyans on building schools and universities and research centers and debate organizations. All of that is absent. It tells you that this is all a big lie. Is this an Arab Spring? Absolutely not. I could easily call it this is a NATO Spring. This is an American Spring. It's not an Arab Spring whatsoever in the meaning of the word. Oppression in the Arab world has forced political action and activity into the only legitimate social space. It was the religious space. This is why it was easy to organize as religious groups. The Muslim Brotherhood, as we've heard yesterday from Mr. Bin Shamsi, they were established in 1928, and they've been organizing throughout all of these years. It was very easy for them, and I witnessed this firsthand in Egypt, when most of the political parties before the revolution and after the revolution were having struggles to organize. The Egyptians and Muslim Brotherhood groups, they were gathering in mosques. It was easy for them to gather there. They were sending their messages loud and straightforward and easy. And that these kind of messages were straightforward. During the referendum in Egypt on the constitution, there were two slogans that were left out. Islam is the solution. If you're unemployed, Islam is the solution. Economy problems, Islam. Corruption problems, it's because of faithlessness. Islam is the solution. And then another slogan, no to chaos, yes to stability. So you vote for no for chaos, yes for stability, then you vote for yes where Islam is the solution. If you look at the small minorities in there, the Coptic Church, on the other hand, they felt threatened by this, and they ordered everybody who in their congregations to vote no. When most of the people were talking about the 50-50 divide in the polls. It came 70-30 for yes, and it was that small slogan, Islam is the solution. And because the Muslim Brotherhood, they replaced the country services, the government services of social welfare, schools, clinics, and they were doing that on the ground for a long period of time. And people have demands not only for dignity, they have demands for jobs and bread, and these are inseparable things. So we offer you the bread, we offer you a job, we offer you the social services, you vote for us. Another thing that is a result of this Arab Spring is we used to have Arab exceptionalism, now we have Gulf exceptionalism. And it is recognized for what it is. The West, the US and Canada and France and Britain, they turn a blind eye to their allies' oppression, and they exert no pressure for democracy whatsoever. As long as they control the oil, there is no need for democracy. The rents from oil, they're silencing dissent, but they cannot silence the recognition of injustice and the struggle to throw all that backwardness that we have in the Arab world forever. I will end on one strategic note, and that's the most serious consequence of what they call the Arab Spring. The most serious consequence is the rebalancing of the world power system. Both Russia and China, they quickly realized that the US and NATO designs are robbing them of their alliances and of their friends in the region. And as such, today, the world is no longer unipolar. The US and NATO designs will no longer pass or rule unchallenged. We've seen examples of the 3 vetoes against Syria, with Syria against the NATO, against the proposals. These vetoes are not because the Russians and the Chinese are the cousins of the Syrians. It's their play in the international arena of having a two-polar world that is happening in there. When the Arab streets are awakened, they're going to be support on the other end. And the US and NATO, they may be prematurely celebrating their gains in Libya, in Yemen, in Egypt, in Tunisia, and maybe in Syria. However, those gains are unsustainable. The one-sided US and NATO support for Israel will once again be a crucial factor in drawing support and alliances in the region. So that's the main defining factor. When all those Arabs awake, it's going to go back to the things that are going to surface again, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and a just solution for that whole equation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Noor and Besma.
Thank you, everybody. Where do you begin? I'm going to be provocative because I think, frankly, as a watcher, avid watcher of the Arab Spring, and as an academic, I must say, for the first time, I feel very embarrassed to say I'm an academic. I've heard, and I'm going to, this is the elephant in the room that I'd like to share with you. I've heard a lot about Ottomanianism, neo-Ottomanian, neoliberal, Zionism, imperialism, colonialism, Pax Americanism, Islamism, Gulfanization. I don't buy it. I just don't buy it. And frankly, I'm tired of it. I'm sharing my frustration with you, but I'm just so tired that the Arab world and the Arab people have been denied agency. Right? So these are all these great global structures. These big global ideas, these big, I don't know, secretive meetings that happen. I mean, I just always sort of imagine the Qataris, the Saudis, the Americans, the Israelis. I mean, how many people are going to put in a room to conspire? This is the big global agenda. But I'm sorry, when the fruit seller in Tunisia burned himself, he wasn't thinking, those Zionists. When Khalid was being beaten up by the Egyptian police, he wasn't saying, oh, those Americans. When those children went up to the board in Daraa to write those fatal words in Syria, down with the regime, they weren't thinking neoliberalism. And I appreciate the fact, as an academic, that we all want to tie this all together. But for the first time in my life, I want to say, all of those great global grand ideas out there, they exist. And yes, they have been oppressive in so many ways. But that doesn't explain what happened. What happened is individuals stood up and said, enough. They stood up and said, enough is enough. No, it's not today that imperialism is subjecting me to the hellish living that I live in. It is the mukhabarat. It is the secret police. It is that person on the corner that told me I can't sell my fruit here without paying the bribe. So I want to question all of this structural arguments to say, where's the agency in this? Why are we so unable to go beyond these grand theories and paradigms, which I learned them. I profess that all of these, these are pills that I've swallowed many a times on so many levels, but it doesn't explain this one. And I can be big enough, I think, as an academic to say, I didn't get it before. It's not about all of these grand theories. In fact, it's about people, individuals. Who knew individuals matter? Right? It's people that made this. It's individuals, it's a domino, and it just happened that way. And yes, Twitter, in the case of Egypt, helped get people out. Is it effective in terms of talking about the debate on what happens after? No. You can't put that in 140 characters on Twitter. We know that. But it did get you and you and you and you out in the street. That's the point. It was individuals. It was the collective individuals that did this. And there's a great Arabic saying, "Shara la shara bi'amlu lihya," which means when you add a hair and a hair and a hair, you make a beard. And the point is, this time, it's about each and every hair that finally stood up and said, enough. I've had it. I'm done. It's not about the grand social big paradigms that we've been talking about. So I'm sorry, that's the elephant in the room that I have to mention. So now I'll put my... So now I'm going to give you my academic argument. But don't worry, I promise I'm going to bring it down a level. Because in trying to grapple with understanding why this happened to me, why happened to the Arab Spring, it's happened to me because it's been my life for the past 18 months. But anyways, I looked up, I'm trying to understand what this is about at the psychological level. And I think psychologists got this right. As a political scientist, as a political economist, it took some soul searching and a lot of reading. And this is, academia is a beautiful thing because we're paid to think all day. It's a great profession. I highly recommend it to my grad students. But, this is a time when a political scientist, not so great in many other ways, but I think he got this one right in the 1960s, talked about this idea of this expectations gap, okay? Gurr, a political scientist, told us that, political violence and upheaval or civil unrest happens when you see a gap between your lot, your particular, take home, and what you think you deserve. Now, if you're an empiricist, you say, how do you measure that? Yes, it's really hard. As a political scientist, I don't know how to do this. The methodology is still a big part of the gap here in my writing, so bear with me. But it's really quite simple because the conundrum of the Middle East here is that it was growing, right? So macroeconomic growth, GDP growth was 4%, 5%, 18%. These are countries that were growing. Tunisia was growing. Egypt was growing. Syria was growing. All of these countries were experiencing economic growth. So what happened? Well, what happened is the growth was 5%, 6% GDP, but the actual per capita gain per person was less than that. So people were improving. I mean, this is one thing that we have this sort of fixation. We think that, and frankly, I'm sorry, but, you can look at neoliberal arguments, and I'm not a fan of neoliberal policies, but at the end of the day, the overall wealth and position of the average Arab person was going up. But the point here is that it wasn't going up fast enough for what the Arab person believed they deserved. Okay? And the deserve is the really important part because it's the immeasurable part. It's really hard, unless you do sort of a psychoanalysis of every Arab person, to get at that. What's that gap? What's that expectation gap? But this is the picture I want to paint to you. The picture I want to paint to you is that the Arab person saw around them success stories, saw around them false symbols of modernization. And I blame this on Gulf investment. I see the link. We had Gulf investments building shopping malls, building high towers. The urban landscape of every Arab city was utterly changing before our eyes. Literally. Buildings in Amman, Jordan, for example, we had one building for the longest time, good old, 9, 10 stories. All of a sudden, in 5, 6 years, now we're trying to build the fastest, highest tower. They're an eyesore, in my opinion, but that's a whole other story. The point is, there were these symbols of what should be success. And the average person, the average Arab individual, felt more and more frustrated. This is not a conspiracy of the Gulf trying to, undermine the Arab world. No. This is Gulf investment, 2003 oil boom, petrodollars. Where do we send them? Where is it hospital? Where is it good investment and unseen opportunity? The Arab world. There's a decent economic explanation that is not a conspiracy to undermine anybody. But yet it was there. So we had these great symbols of modernization in the Arab world, and the average person is not attaining it. And for me, it was very vivid when I would go into a mall in the Middle East and see young people. This is a young people's revolution. A young person, you'd sit down and watch, and these young people who are, in every probably society are mall rats, right? Sorry, you are. I have an addiction to shopping too, I will gladly admit. However, they're not buying anything because they can't afford to buy anything. So they're told as an individual, and remember here, the Arab world is educated. I mean, let's get our own fixation, this I call it the Canadian Afghanistan fixation, where we say we need to really educate girls. No, in fact, girls are more educated in the Middle East than boys. There's more graduates of university that are women in the Middle East than men. It's not about education. It's about what are they putting in their own pocket at the end of the day. Underemployment of youth is a phenomena of the Arab world that is unimaginable. In Egypt, it's 60 to 70% of youth who are unemployed. What does that mean? That means you are an educated, you are told you are a doctor, you are an engineer, and Egyptian language, you're into Dunya, you're this great professional who's done it all, but you can't afford anything. Go to the mall and walk around and pretend that you're somebody, but you're nobody. That's the indignity. And it's not, that's just one, I'm not trying to trivialize, by using the consumer, lens here to understand. It's in every facet of life, okay? So you go to get your paperwork done, you as an educated young person, which is the majority of our population in the Arab world, right? 60 to 70% of the population of the Arab world is between that 15 and 24. They are young. They are educated. They feel confident. They know what they deserve, right? That's the gap. They know what they deserve. But they go to that booth in the civil office to get their paper done, and they're humiliated. It's the corruption when they're stopped by the police and told they have to pay a bribe. That's the indecency. And that expectation gap grows into frustration. And where does the frustration go? Well, it goes into a safe place. That safe place was online. That safe place was online because, frankly, the government was too busy using, 40-year-old mukhabarat who basically stood around in movie theaters trying to get, subversives instead of going online. I mean, now they've caught up. But the reality is, that's where they were thinking the subversion was. They didn't know the subversion was online, so to speak. And so the young people clamored onto chat groups, clamored onto Facebook, and vented out their frustration. And what do you know? They realized that shara ala shara bi'amlu lahya. hair by hair makes a beard. They realize, wow, you're also a 25-year-old sitting at home with your master's degree and still hoping that mom and dad gave you some money to go on your online chat group? I mean, this is the ultimate humiliation. And who did this? Well, according to the list, I don't think it's any of this list that I heard today. I don't think it's Ottomanism, neoliberalism, Zionism, imperialism, colonialism, Pax Americanism, Islamism, and Gulfinization. I think it's the very leaders who claim to be representing these people. They are the ones that failed. They're the ones at the end of the day that are responsible for the frustration, for the poor policies, for the terrible decision-making that they have caused. And they're the ones that are being held accountable today. When you go to Tahrir Square, I didn't see any signs. I didn't see any signs saying, the Gulf Arabs, you're ruining my life. I didn't see the signs in Tunisia or in Tunis and Damascus today. That's not what people are fighting. People are now saying, you are accountable to us. And this is the most refreshing thing that I think of the Arab Spring. The most refreshing aspect of the Arab Spring to me is that the Arab person, the Arab individual, has woken up and said, you know what? These grand theories, these grand structural problems, yeah, I know that they're out there. I know that they've been a part of my story, my history, my past. But now, yeah, it's that person who's in that presidential palace, in that prime minister's office, that I am holding accountable. And to me, that's the best thing about the Arab Spring. Thank you very much.
Besma, thank you so much, both for the analysis and for the passion. That was really fantastic. Hind.
First, I'm Christian, Arabs, liberal, but I don't eat bacon like Rami. And influenced by a beautiful Islamic culture, since I live in Damascus, and I'm proud to fast every year, Laylatul Qadr. First, I don't want to spend too much time in thanking, but I just want to thank Rima and Besma and Catherine Hamilton for including me in this. I really thank you. I want to be a little bit passionate like Besma, and I'll go back to my papers. I promise you, and I will be so fast. Yes, it is an Arab Spring. Christians, Arabs who lived in Damascus went to the university, and I was young when what happened in Hama. I heard my mother whispering, they're all scared. We cannot talk in the restaurant. We've been limited in challenging each other or questioning the right questions. When I see my children and Muhammad and all those young children and youth are in the street, my student who I teach in Damascus, conflict resolution, they're struggling for their freedom. They go to the streets. They're looking back, and I look at them, I say, you know what? I'm proud of you. You're doing things I couldn't do. And this is what's happening. What they want, these people, it's not conspiracy for sure. As Basma said, those children in Daraa, they didn't have their small meeting with Netanyahu and Obama or the Qatari and tell them go and write something in the wall. They did. Everybody in Syria and Arab Spring, they want something dignity. So I want to speak about Damascus and Syria, especially because this is the subject close to my heart. Yes, the Arab world, maybe they want puppet, like what Noor said, but this time it's not up to the Western world to decide what we want. This is us. We stand and we say, enough. Enough. We can't take it anymore. I can't see anymore and social justice in the street. I can't see my Syria, who I love, to be like the Animal Farm, like George Orwell. All you read the book. I can't see somebody I know is being called animal. They have a name. This is the dignity. When the people went to the street and say, الشعب السوري ما بينزل. We don't want to be humiliated anymore. They don't. So it is not about what the West want, it is what we want. We want dignity. And when Noor said the NATO spring, it's insulting. It's insulting for all those people who died in the street. Insulting for my friends who were spending in prison. For Mazen Darwish, who's still in prison and we don't know where is he. It's insulting. And it's insulting for my friend Caroline Ayoub, a Christian who stayed in prison 25 days. Just insulting her in the prison, telling her, you Christian, excuse my language, I can't say it, whatever. So, yes, it's not a NATO spring, it's a Syrian spring. And we've been waiting for this spring a long time ago. And when Noor said we need bottom up, we tried. Arif Dalila, our economic professor, spent 6 years in prison. Ask Michel Kilo, ask Muhammad's parents, fathers and brothers who I met. We've been trying to do it bottom up. We tried so hard. We tried to talk about reforms. We tried to talk about debate. We tried to have a little bit of freedom. So we tried, and they call it Arab Damascus Spring. We've been tried so hard to do it. There is a good things coming from this revolution. Yes, it's looking very dark now, and I can see this, and we suffer every day. 250 people died 3 days ago. It's the 21st century Holocaust, and people are watching. And this is so unfair for people still defending the regime who's killing 250 people from his own people. And if Russia wants to veto, Chinese wants to veto, and the Qatar want to interfere and pay in Saudis or Iran, all those people, I agree, they are interfering in our business. But in the end of the day, there is 250 mothers died without her child. And there is 250 people die for the Arab Spring. If we want it or not, if people want it or not, and they agree about it, we have 20,000 people today died in Syria, and there is many people in prisons. And this is what we need. In the end of the day, know that regardless of all the conspiracy theory, we have a struggle. And we know that spring is coming, and Damascus is going to be as beautiful as before, and we're going to go live together, all of us, Christian, Alawites, Ismailis, Sunnis, everybody, because this is the way we lived before. As Rami said, we're not minorities. I never felt as a minority. This is my country. They might give us some more, the government will give us more religion freedoms because they want, in the end of the day, to get our loyalties. But for this religion freedoms, I told my mother, she's 75, she's scared. She's scared that to go to church on Sunday. I told her, Mom, freedom is much better than to go on Sunday to the church. Just, we don't have to worry. This is a revolution. We need to be patient about it. It's not a Tylenol pills we're going to be, next day everything is shiny. How much I have? 7 minutes? Okay. So in my papers, I divided minorities, a larger minority group and smaller minority group. In the larger minority group, I talked about the Kurdish and the historically they are inhabited larger area in Syria, Iraq, Turkey, and Iraq. And why I'm distinguishing this? For a simple reason, because this group is seen by some to constitute a threat to national sovereignty, unity, independence, and territorial integrity. And there is lots of discrimination policy made against those minority because they have the ambitions to create Kurdistan. And what they did in Syria, they stripped many of them the Syrian citizenship in 1962 and rendering them effectively stateless. And there is lots of policy displacing Kurdish and other ethnic grouping from their homes and replacing them with the Arab families. And of course, not to mention the chemical attack on Halabja. There is about 5,000 Kurdish died. And similar from these groups, we have the smaller groups, which is like Christian Ismailis and Druze. This community were guaranteed great religious freedom as means of widening the support base of regime in an effort to tighten its control over the country and ensure its survival. This is a perfect example of this practice can be found in the Syrian regime. This is exactly what happens. Because they use this policy to gain the support among us all, like my mothers and my great-grandmothers and everybody. It must be said that while those minority groups were guaranteed freedom of religion, there is a very little evidence of such favoritism when it comes to civil, economic, or personal liberty. So they will give them the liberty to go to church, practice, but when it comes to civil liberty, they don't. They're all treated the same. There is no equality, and there is no social justice. I'm going to talk about this lavish Christmas celebration in Damascus. I live in the old city, and 2010 Christmas, leaving the church, there is like 1,000 Santa Claus parade in Bab-Tuma. And I'm just like wondering, 1,000 Santa Claus parade, this won't even happen in the Vatican. And I'm just like comparing, like, what about the majority Muslim Sunnis who cannot even celebrate the Nabi, Mawlid al-Nabi, properly like the others? So why they're doing this? This is all, it's just like paying, like getting the approved that, oh, look at us, the Christians, look at how we give you the freedom, like in the Palm Sunday, my mother lived in a street where there is the big Catholic church there. There is a parade, streets are closed just to walk and sing and celebrate Sunday. So all this, these long-standing practices lead us to think of the role of minority and minority competition in the Arab Spring. Okay, 3 minutes, okay. And of course, this is all logistically all supported by the regime. These are all important. The support of some members of the minority population to the regime can be understood in light of their having benefited from freedom of religion used by the regime as a tool of control. This oppressive government is now calling on these ties and alliances, which nurturing fears of violence and discriminations against minorities, both in the current state of war and in any future regime that would replace it. But it's important to remember that while we have no right to dictate to the majority how to rule the government in the post-Arab Spring era, we as minority group have to empower ourselves politically and through civil society activists in order to ensure that minority group rights are upheld, at the very least, and only if full secular state are not attainable. And there is some few questions. I still have 2 minutes. 2 minutes. And just you all might think that what's happening in Syria, and there is this propaganda that it's a sectarian revolution, and it's the Sunni against the Alawites, and why those Sunnis, what is, and there is some few questions I put. It's like, why the women in the demonstrations, they're wearing scarves? Simply, like my niece is Lebanese, her great-grandfather is the Maronite Huwayik, you know him. She put scarves so they don't see her identity. So they're not, all of them are Muslim practicing. There are many of them Christian or Alawite only, even putting scarves. And also, why they are looking Islamist? Why this big beard? Because they have no time to shave. And so like everybody, like they look at Abdurrazzaq class, oh, he has this big beard, he's an Islamist. He has no time. He has no time for this. And also, why they're getting out of the mosque in the beginning of the demonstration. Now, of course, with all the killing, it's rarely they can go to a demonstration. Why it's starting from the mosque? Because the mosque is the only place you can meet and go without a security permissions. And I'm assure you that many Ismailis and Christian and Alawite, they were in the Umayyad mosque the second week of the demonstrations, and I was there. And should the Christian and other minority worry of the future? For sure not. Democracy can be good for everybody. And democracy can be a very good thing to live, like you all do. So what you're living now is dignity, and what we want is dignity. What you live in freedom, and what we want is freedom. And I assure you, yes, it is an Arab Spring, and it's coming soon. Thank you.